and welcome. This is the start of a four-part series that we will do on perspectives of Southern Jewry on slavery, secession, all the way through civil rights. In many ways, the experience of Southern Jews was very different than those in the North. This is an area that I've always had a deep and abiding interest in, not just Southern Jewish history, but the relationship between African Americans and Jews. Going back to my undergraduate days, I was an American history major in college, but my area of focus was on African American history. And at that time, I saw some of my own experiences as a Jew through the lens of the challenges and obstacles that African Americans faced in this country. I'm certainly not the only one who did that. Jews were disproportionately represented in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And Judaism, with its imagery of the Exodus from Egypt, has long captured the imagination of African Americans. All that being said, as I learned over the subsequent 30 years, there are myriad differences between these two communities. And yet my interest has only grown over the years, just in its own right. I am actually looking up at my bookshelf right now, and I have quite a lot of books on African American history and African American Jewish history. So this is something that I hope that I can bring my interest and my thoughts and what I've learned over the years in some focused and concentrated way. As always, I believe the past is a springboard for us to think about how we got to where we are and what the meaning of the present is for us. Not that the past repeats itself, especially if we remember it. So past is not necessarily a guide to the future, but it's very difficult to chart a future without knowing where one has come from. All that being said, as we look at the history of Jews in the American South, there's a lot to be gleaned about Jewish self-perception, as well as the extent to which we take on the attitudes and culture of the larger society in which we live. That's certainly true across the board, and it was no less true in the antebellum South, and later on in the South of Jim Crow and segregation. But even then, we'll see Jews were a little different. We were largely a white community, and yet there is a marginality to being Jewish in the South over the course of centuries. And even to this day, certainly in many Southern Jewish communities, not everywhere, but all of those things we'll see adumbrated, echoed, foreshadowed in the events of the 16, 17, and 1800s. So I want to start with a little bit of background on Jews in the slave trade. Over the course of 3+ centuries, there were 12 million Africans that were brought to this hemisphere. Not all of them were brought to North America. Many were enslaved and brought to Caribbean islands, or to various parts of Central and South America. But 12 million people is a lot of people. And that slave trade took place over 3 centuries. And it certainly changed from the 1500s through the 1800s. Historians typically talk about 3 periods conveniently divided by the century. So the first phase is 1500 to 1600, dominated mostly by the Spanish and the Portuguese. 1600 to 1700, with growing influence by the Dutch. In the 17th century, the Dutch were really big commercial powers. And of course, with growing English influence as the British Empire expanded. And then in the 17th through the 1800s, in which Britain was a major player. There were others as well, but Britain was a major player in the slave trade. The slave trade is abolished in the early years of the 19th century, at least in theory, although there were still people engaging in it as late as the 1840s and 1850s. It was against international law, but still, very lucrative. Overall, Jews were represented in the slave trade, but they were fairly marginal and fairly localized. Now, there have been a lot of claims, especially in the last 30 years, anti-Semitic claims about the extent to which Jews were involved in the slave trade. Those claims say far less about the actual history than about those who made those claims. The first, of course, was Nation of Islam. Louis Farrakhan and his friends published a book. Actually, it was a series of books on the secret power of Jews. And the first volume was, which was entitled The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 1, made the claim that Jews were largely responsible for financing and overseeing the slave trade. Perniciously enough, the editor of the book quoted very selectively Jewish sources, making sure to take out any and all references that actually said the very opposite. But it did allow him to use sources like the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1906 and a variety of other places where he would selectively quote. There were others who embraced that anti-Semitic myth as well. David Duke, gee, what a surprise. He promoted it on Twitter and on his website. And if you may recall, back in the early 90s, there was a wacko, that's a technical term, wacko, who was also a professor at the City College of New York, Leonard Jeffries. He was quite a piece of work. Sadly, he was the chair of the Department of African American Studies, or Afro-American Studies, and he too echoed these these anti-Semitic charges. Most recently, one of the friends of Jeremy Corbyn, Labor Party candidate who thankfully stepped down, a woman named Jackie Walker, who made headlines for her criticism in 2016 that Jews were the chief financiers of the African slave trade. None of that is true. That doesn't mean Jews weren't involved. They were. So what do we know? The place and time where Jews were most involved were in Brazil and in the Caribbean. But even so, it's unlikely that less than 1% of all of the enslaved Africans, those 12 million people, were in any way purchased or sold by Jewish merchants. There were a number of so-called new Christians. Sometimes those folks are called Marranos. And these were the folks in Spain, and then a few years later in Portugal, who were given the choice: become Christian, or get your tuchuses out of here, or die. The choice is yours. So these so-called new Christians had, under pressure, remained in Spain or Portugal and converted to Christianity, but their troubles didn't end. They were highly suspected and distrusted by the folks who came to be called old Christians. And so many of them who were pushed out of opportunities for business or investment or trade within Spain or Portugal found a kind of niche in the Atlantic slave trade that was growing just in the decades after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and then in Portugal. The Jews in Spain were expelled in 1492, in Portugal in 1497. In the United States, there were a number of slave traders. Many of them were Sephardic. Either they had roots in Spain or sometimes in Holland. Once upon a time, Holland belonged to Spain. It won its independence. It fought a number of wars of independence against Spain, but it won its independence in the early years of the late years rather, of the 16th century. Jews had gone to Holland, where they were granted a lot more religious freedom. Holland was Protestant, very business oriented, and Jews had the opportunity economically that they wouldn't have had in most other places in Europe. So folks like Isaac da Costa, right? That's a nice Spanish Portuguese Jewish name. Isaac da Costa of Charleston, David Franks of Philadelphia. He actually was a German Jew. Aaron Lopez of Newport. So note that not all of these Jews are in the South, right? Slavery during the time of the colonial period was legal all throughout the 13 colonies. It tended to be more concentrated in the South because of the nature of agriculture, large-scale agriculture in the South. But by no means, there were plenty of slaves in New York, in Philadelphia, in Massachusetts, in Newport, all over. In fact, people don't realize that slavery, even though it was becoming increasingly rare, it wasn't abolished in New York State until 1827. So I want to just show you now. I'm going to bring this up. Let's see. Okay. Here's interesting. Right. Let me just get this up. And share my screen with all of you. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see this. So this was an ad from the Charleston, South Carolina Gazette from September of 1784. It was an ad by Abraham Sessius, right? It's not Sexius. Abraham Satius was a relative of one of the Jews who came to New Amsterdam, right, about 130 years before this was written. His family, so they were bona fide members of the DAR. They came to New Amsterdam with 54 Jews, escaping the Inquisition of the Portuguese. And the family prospered, had many children, branches. Excuse me. So Abraham Satius was a slave dealer, right? So he was not involved in the trade, but he did buy and sell slaves. He was a merchant. And he put this ad in the South Carolina newspaper. This is shortly after the Revolutionary War, right? Also gracious, once again does offer his services pure, for to secure money in the coffer. He has for sale some Negroes male, will suit full well grooms. He has likewise some of their wives, I'm not sure what that is, can something clean dirty rooms. For planting too, he has a few, to sell all for the cash of various price, to work the rice or bring them to the lash. The young ones true, if that will do, may some be had of him, to learn your trade they may be made, or bring them to your trim. The boatmen great will you elate, they are so brisk and free. Whate'er you say, they will obey, if you buy them of me. Okay, some suggestions, okay. So it's probably can make clean dirty rooms. Yes, I agree. Thank you, Lisa and Alan and Rebecca. So this is by no means something that was typical and ordinary and everyday. It's not like you saw Jews advertising slaves for sale in newspapers all the time. On the other hand, things like this did happen. And this was just part of the society in which, let me just stop screen share. There we go. The society in which these folks lived. If you're really interested in a scholarly study of, but it's pretty easy to read. It's well written. There's a fellow named Eli Faber who wrote a book on the slave trade, Jews in the slave trade. He is a professor at John Jay College of Criminology in New York. And his conclusions were that the claim of Jewish domination in the slave trade was false. Jews were a minority of investors. They did not own the slave ships. They did not invest extensively in slave ventures. Jews certainly owned slaves, but then again, many did as well. And I'm not apologizing for it. This is just the way it was. But let's also remember that there were many folks involved in the slave trade and in the ownership of slaves. Arabs, the Berber people of North Africa, scores of African ethnic groups that on occasion would sell rivals to various slavers as a result of capturing them in war. Italians, Portuguese, Spaniards, Dutch, obviously we said some Jews, Germans, Swedes, French, English, Danes, Native Americans. Native Americans, particularly in the South, were known to own slaves. And yes, even free blacks owned slaves as well. Not many, but there were New World African Americans who had been emancipated or who were descended from freed slaves, but who became slaveholding farmers or planters themselves. It's hard for us to really get into the mindset of what it was like to live with slavery as something so normal, just a part of life. But if you were to live in 19th century America, even in the North, especially in the South, but even in the North, slavery was not viewed with the horror that we would come to view it later. Abolitionists, and there were Jews who were certainly represented in the abolitionist cause, and I'll talk about one fellow in a moment, represented, a margin of American society. Abolitionists were viewed often as cranks and were the subject of violence, not only in the South, but in the North. There were Northerners who did not like abolitionists, either because their attitudes seemed to be not sufficiently racist. Keep in mind that even if you did not support slavery, you were not an advocate of white-black equality. Others despised abolition because they felt it was riling up the South unnecessarily. So abolitionists were they grew, but until the 1820s or 30s, those who were really hardcore abolitionists were very much at the margin, especially those who absolutely were uncompromising opponents of slavery. Even our founding fathers who despised slavery, like John Adams, certainly in the end came to understandings and compromises about the existence of slavery as a necessity to keep the country together. So, what about Jews in the South in terms of slave owning? Okay. As many as 3/4 of Jewish families in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah, especially those three cities. Remember, Jews were concentrated in urban cities. They weren't in, Calford, which is, well, actually, Florida wasn't even yet part of the United States. But Jews in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah, about 3/4 of them owned slaves. Now, they didn't have huge plantations. They might have had, one or two or three household slaves. As far as we can tell, until the middle of the 19th century, say around 1820, 1830, about 40% of Jewish households across the South owned slaves. Now, the Jewish population in all of these places was pretty small, right? So the total number of slaves they owned were a tiny fraction of the total slave population, right? So if I tell you Charleston's Jews owned a total of 93 slaves in 1790, well, that is between probably about a dozen different families, extended families. But so the numbers of slaves owned were on the small side, right? Jews, again, being an urban population, didn't engage in large-scale plantation culture. Right? There were very few Jews who owned numerous slaves. So in 1830, there were about 45,000 slave owners in the United States. The vast majority of them, obviously, by that point in the South. There were only 120 Jews among the 45,000 who owned 20 or more slaves. And among the 12,000 slave owners that owned 50 or more slaves, there are only 20 Jews. Right, so when you talk about that large plantation scale agriculture, you're talking about 20 Jews out of 12,000. But even if you add, both the 45,000 and the 12,000 together, keep in mind that still represents a minority of the South's population. Among the white population of the South, most people did not own slaves. Dirt poor farmers did not own slaves. That doesn't mean that they were opposed to slavery, but slaves were very expensive. And unless you had the wherewithal, you weren't going to be owning any slaves. Now, there's been some interesting studies done about how Jews treated their slaves. Right now, there's limited evidence. Right, we don't have video cams from the 1830s. We didn't have any GoPros. We didn't have any, smartphones where people could take pictures. But one of the interesting places to see how Jews treated their slaves was looking at their wills. So we have a bunch of different wills from the antebellum South. They're held at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So if you ever want to go see them, you can go to Cincinnati. And between 1789 and 1865, there are in that collection 33 wills that speak specifically about slaves. That's a small sample. That's interesting to see. Okay. That was from. 19 of the 33 simply left their slaves to their next of kin without specific instructions. Right? They were property. You could inherit slaves. 5 instructed their executors to of the will to sell their slaves. In other words, not keep them in the family, but sell them. And that could be profitable, especially if you were in debt. One of the reasons that Thomas Jefferson sold his slaves is because his estate was deeply in debt. But we have records from the estate of Emanuel Stern, Jewish fellow who died in New Orleans in 1828, and another one of the centers of Jewish life in the Confederacy. And he sold off his 12-year-old slave Matilda at auction for $400, even though she had originally only been valued for $250. $400 in 1828 was a lot of money. On the other hand, we have instances where slaves had relationships with their Jewish owners. Again, we're not, this is stuff that happened just across the board. There's nothing that makes the Jewish relationships between owners and slaves more remarkable than other folks. But Emma Mordecai, who had been living in Richmond 2 years after the end of the Civil War, receives a beautiful letter from her former slave, Sarah Norris, beautifully written. She indicates her gratitude for her former mistress teaching her how to read and write, which, by the way, was against the law. And even though Emma has fled with her family, Richmond, which really had been completely bombed and destroyed in the last weeks of the conflict, Sarah assures her former mistress that she and her husband are looking after the family graves in the Richmond Jewish Cemetery. We have other wills of folks who freed their slaves, and if we take a quick look over here, down here, way down here, we'll get to him in a moment. This was Isaiah Isaacs of Charlottesville. And he kind of echoes Thomas Jefferson. He had received slaves as payment for a debt. He did not own slaves prior to that, but slaves could be used as any property for the payment of a debt. And his will very explicitly freed them, right? Being of the opinion that all men are by nature equally free, and being possessed of some of those beings who are unfortunately doomed to slavery. As to them, I must enjoy upon my executors a strict observance of the following clause in my will, which was to free them and to give them the value of $20 in clothing on the day of their manumission. So really, what we're seeing is, all over the place in terms of attitudes toward slaves. We have other cases. If you're interested, this is a great book, Jews and the Civil War. It's an anthology of different historians. It's edited by Jonathan Sarna. You may recall he wrote a really good book on the history of American Jewry. In fact, he was in Jacksonville a whole bunch of years ago at the JCA Book Festival. But this is a good book. And another classic is Bertram Korn, American Jewry and the Civil War. And he talks a lot about the antebellum period. So I'm going to stop there for a moment, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the controversies on the eve of the Civil War between some of the rabbis. And then we'll talk about Jews actually in the conflict itself. But I want to feel free if you have a question or a comment germane to the topic to unmute yourself, or you can send it along via chat if you prefer.
Robert, so I guess you're going to get to this. Wasn't there a Jew that was prominent in the Confederacy? He was Secretary of the Treasury or something?
There were a number of Jews who were prominent in the Confederacy.
Judah P. Benjamin.
Judah P. Benjamin is the most prominent, but there's some folks who, were they Jewish, like David Yulee Levy. Levy County, Florida is named after him. It's kind of funny that, there aren't too many Levies in Levy County. And the county seat is named Yankeetown, of all strange things. But David Levy was a very successful planter who also built Florida's first railroad from Cedar Key to Fernandina Beach, about a 100-mile line. Cedar Key was a port on the Gulf side, and of course, Fernandina was back in its day, not insignificant port on the Atlantic, and he was a fire-breathing secessionist, staunch defender of slavery. Now he had converted to marry his wife. His family was originally from the Caribbean, Sephardic Jew. So I don't know if he counts. And then there were other very prominent Jews who were, actually supporting the Confederacy. But the most prominent, as Maher pointed out, is Judah P. Benjamin. He was a big-time planner in New Orleans. He never, he was not, he married a Catholic woman. His children were raised as Catholics, but he never denied his Jewishness. Unlike Mr. Yulee, Benjamin, it was there. He never, he wasn't proud of it. He didn't go to shul, but he never denied it either. He, at one point, I believe, had been the Attorney General for the state of Louisiana, but he, in the Confederacy, he served in a number of different roles. He was in the Secretary of War position. He was the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. So really the number 3 position after Alexander Stephens, who was the Vice President of the Confederacy. So he was pretty important. After the war, he flees to England. That's where he spends the rest of his life.
Rabbi, excuse me.
Evelyn.
I wanted to go back to Charleston, if I may. And
Okay.
also, you talked about slave owners, Jewish slave owners who had 50 slaves, 30 slaves. I'm willing to bet
20 or more versus 50 or more. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm willing to bet, first of all, is that those Jewish slave owners owned the sugar plantations in Louisiana. And
Well, these were where they were located, I don't know.
No,
might have been.
They were Jewish owners. Okay.
Yes.
Now to get back to Charleston, in those days of slavery, the house of the white person was on the street. Then there are alleys that go behind those houses. And behind those houses are the small houses where the slaves lived. Now, after slavery ended, these black families stayed in those houses. And it's a term, since you may have heard of in sociology, called marble caking. Have you ever heard that term?
Marble caking. I like marble cake, but no.
Well, it refers to the fact that really the city of Charleston in those old neighborhoods was integrated because the white people lived in the big houses on the street, and the black families who were descended from the slaves lived in those little houses on the alley.
Well, there's integration and there's integration, but yes, in a sense, that's true.
Rabbi, I wanted to ask a question.
Go ahead, and then we're going to keep going. Go ahead, Michelle.
I would wonder if the Jewish families would have wanted, let's say, to pay their slaves, not have them as slaves, but have them more as servants, that if they would have wanted to do that, that would have really put them in a bad situation in that culture, and so putting it in context, I would wonder whether there were any Jewish families that actually had black household and property help that they actually paid rather than had slave help, and how that might have been. Because I would imagine that the Jewish families, if they did have some controversy with slavery, that would not have sat well for them, you know, in that culture at that time.
Well, in the South, there was
Not sure.
there was no controversy about owning slaves. There were a number of, just across the board,
57.
there were slave owners who were did allow their slaves to, you know, earn some side income from a variety of, as long as it didn't interfere with their tasks. Now, they didn't have to do this, but there were some who thought it might, you know, encourage industry or build character. And there were slave owners. Again, you know, slave owning is always horribly demeaning, but it was not always, though often it could be incredibly brutal and cruel. There were invariably some who saw themselves in a very paternalistic and benevolent role. You know, even though that was hugely condescending.
Not sure.
But that being said, who would, you know, on occasion give their slaves some pocket money, but these were things that were done, you know, as a gesture of goodwill or a favor. These were not things that slaves were entitled to receive. We know that one fellow, let me quote him here, Solomon Cohen, nice Jewish name, lived in, I believe he lived in Savannah, but he had probably 18 to 20 slaves that he rented out. And people would do that. It was, you know, you own the slave and you could earn money. This was something that, you know, if you read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, he talks about being rented out by his master, you know, as to do odd jobs or work on other farms to bring in money that didn't go to Douglass, that went back to his owner. So Solomon Cohen wrote to his sister in the 1850s, "I believe that the institution of slavery was refined and civilizing to whites, giving them an elevation of sentiment and ease and dignity of manners, only attainable in societies under the restraining influence of a privileged class, and at the same time the only human institution," right, slavery, "that could elevate the Negro from barbarism and develop the small amounts of intellect with which he is endowed." Plenty of Southerners use those kinds of sentiments. Stonewall Jackson, who was by no means the harshest of slave owners, Robert E. Lee, talked about how slavery was necessary to civilize African Americans because they were just too undeveloped and inferior. So these were just sentiments of the time. Jews were not, you know, more so, but they were not
exactly
less.
sure how I get you on here.
Let me get everybody again.
Rabbi, can I make a comment?
Go ahead, Laurie.
Yeah, you talk about Cohen. I had a patient from Stark, an African-American woman. Her name was Cohens, C-O-H-E-N-S, and perhaps And I asked her about her name, and she said that, you know, the family was Cohen that owned her, and so they took the name of Cohens.
That's possible.
One other
That
comment.
certainly is. Go ahead.
During the 17th and 18th century, when they had the sugar, molasses, rum, and slave trade, the triangular trade that went from Britain to the United States, the Caribbean, and back to Europe, I was under the impression that a number of Jews were involved in that triangular trade. And since it did include slaves, perhaps more Jews were involved in one way or another in that endeavor.
So I talked about this earlier. The prevailing historical evidence is that the numbers were small. Where they may have been larger were among the New Christians, right, aka the Marranos. But after 1600, Spanish and Portuguese influence diminished dramatically in the slave trade. So, but the answer is yes. They were not in control of. They were not predominant. They were not. They were in small numbers, but yes, there were at least. One more book I'll recommend. Most of the most of the abolitionists did live in the North. Some of them were German emigres, Jewish emigres from Germany who had fought in the liberal revolutions of 1848, and when most of those failed, came to the United States, and so slavery became another cause to fight for. Frederick Douglass actually had a relationship, not clear, but with a Jewish woman who went up to live in Rochester and work for him. But this is sort of like the Jewish answer to Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Kidnapped and the Ransomed. It's a story. It's based on a true story of two Jewish brothers who lend money to a slave to buy his freedom, which was prohibited. It was against the law in many southern states to do that, and helped him escape across the Ohio River. So it was originally originally published in 1856, but The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, I've had this book since I was a kid. It was from the Jewish Publication Society, but I think it's still available. And it's, if you like Uncle Tom's Cabin, I mean, you'll like this book, The Kidnapped and the Ransomed. So there were a number of Jews from the South who ended up becoming abolitionists, but they didn't stay in the South. Wasn't good for your health. So they did leave.
No, I don't think so. I don't know how to do it.
Okay. So what I wanted to do, let me go back to, I want to talk about a couple rabbis.
Forget it.
Funny.
I don't want to say it anymore.
I always like talking about rabbis.
You learn something.
No, I know. I read this book.
Okay, here we are. All right. So, three rabbis. Maybe we'll throw in another rabbi or two. This was Reverend M.J. Raffel, or Raphael. He was the rabbi of congregation B'nai Yeshurun. Same B'nai Yeshurun that is, a happy clappy, lots of dancing, music, Upper West Side of Manhattan. This, of course, was 150, whatever, 160 years ago. But BJ, I don't think it was called BJ in those days, but B'nai Jeshurun, was really the first Ashkenazi synagogue in New York, 1825. And he wrote an article. This was a little bit of background. This is after Lincoln's election, but before his inauguration. Back in the day, presidents weren't inaugurated until March. Now it's January, and President Buchanan, who was still the president, declared a national day of fasting in January of 1861. Right, the Union is on the brink. A bunch of southern states have already seceded, including Florida. And the Upper South has not yet seceded, not clear what they will do. So the Union is teetering on the brink. The president declares a day of fasting, and all over the country, ministers give sermons. So here was a sermon on the day of the national fast by Reverend M.J. Raphael, who, interestingly, now this is, he is in New York. By the way, New York was a hotbed of Confederate sentiment, right? A lot of the cotton that went to Europe came through New York, and there were a lot of immigrants who had nothing good to say or think about slavery or African Americans. Often they vied, free African Americans, free people of color vied for the same horrible marginal jobs that the Irish vied for. And the worst anti-union draft riots, the worst civilian violence against the Union took place in New York in 1863. But Reverend Raphael is saying that, hey, you can't argue with the Torah. The Torah allows for slavery. Right? Well, it's true. I mean, there is slavery in the Torah. All right, I'm not going to read through all of this. Right? He mentions that the Ten Commandments, some of these abolitionists, like Henry Beecher Ward, famous preacher of the Congregational Church, First Congregational Church of Brooklyn, later involved with a naughty scandal with one of his parishioners. That's still in the future. So he takes, he chides Beecher about his anti-slavery stance. He says, hey, you even have slavery mentioned in the Ten Commandments. How dare you denounce slaveholding as a sin? Right? When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Job, right? That all these men were slaveholders, does it not strike you that you are guilty of something very little short of blasphemy? However, he goes on to say, the slavery that existed in the Torah and in the Bible is nothing like the slavery that's practiced in the South. The heathen view of slavery, which prevailed at Rome, right, in which slaves were just chattel, and which I am sorry to say is adopted in the South, reduces the slave to a thing, and a thing can have no rights. The result to which the Bible view of slavery leads us is that slavery existed since the earliest time, that slaveholding is no sin, and that slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments, but also that the slave is a person and has rights not conflicting with the lawful exercise of the rights of his owner. So he says, you know, a pox on both of you. You northern folk, you're just too damn self-righteous. But you know what? To our southern fellow citizens, right, the Bible would have you adopt a more humane form of slavery and discard the heathen slave code, which permits a few bad men to indulge in an abuse of power that throws a stigma and disgrace on the whole body of slaveholders. Right? He says slaveholding, you know, it's allowed by the Bible. It's the way that people act that gives slaveholding a bad name. And then he goes on to offer pious prayers that hopefully the Union won't split apart, which a few months later after Fort Sumter is exactly what happened. Then we have this fellow who a few days later writes a response to Reverend Matthew, David Einhorn. Now, Einhorn is a rabbi in Baltimore. Baltimore is a southern city. In fact, Lincoln had to be disguised to sneak him through Baltimore. He had to change trains in Baltimore to get to Washington for his own inauguration, and there was a plot afoot to kill him. So even though Baltimore remained in the Union, Maryland remained in the Union, it was a slave state, and it had lots and lots of Confederate sympathizers. So here's this rabbi in Baltimore who says, right, just because the Bible allows for slavery, it doesn't mean that it favors, approves, and justifies and sanctions it as a moral aspect. Right? He goes on to say, what about polygamy? We've gotten rid of polygamy. It's in the Bible. Is this an argument for that we should go back to having polygamy? Right? So with all the hollow clamor about the rationalism of our day, it must be conceded that the Mosaic law, as in the case of blood vengeance and the marriage of a war prisoner, these are mitzvot that are in Deuteronomy, that to the modern reader would seem very harsh. Here, merely tolerated the institution in view of once existing deeply rooted social conditions, or more correctly, evils, and recognized it in reference to civil rights, even but never approved of or considered it pleasing in the sight of God. So he goes on to say, yeah, you're right. It's in the Torah, but that doesn't mean the Torah is approving it. On the contrary, it is a concession to people's backwardness at that time. But if you read everything that the Torah has to say, or the rabbis have to say about servitude, it is to try to tame and humanize an evil institution with the hope that eventually it will fade away. It is not meant to be a defense of the morality of that institution. Now, Einhorn, who is a very passionate anti-slavery advocate, has no choice but to flee Baltimore. And I mean flee. There were a group of men who were out looking for him to tar and feather him. I don't know if they were from the Jewish community or not. They didn't catch him. Einhorn fled to Philadelphia, and that's where he stayed. He took a pulpit in Philadelphia and found other folk more conducive to his views. But it was a tremendous amount of moral courage on his part that he spoke so passionately against slavery in Baltimore, of all places. And that kind of moral courage was quite extraordinary. Many rabbis were kind of betwixt and between. Isaac Mayer Weiss, one of the most important rabbis of the Reform movement in the United States, was kind of lukewarm. He certainly believed in preserving the Union, but he would have been willing to compromise on slavery to save it. But then again, and he's living in Cincinnati at the time, which is also, it's right on the Ohio River. It's across from Kentucky. Yes, it's in the north, but sort of not really. And Southern Ohio was filled with Northern Democrats known as Copperheads, who, especially as the war went on, wanted to make peace with the South, who felt that the price of union was just too high. So one other document I'm going to share, and then I'll take a couple of moments and talk about actual, in the Confederacy, the armed forces, and then questions, comments, and we'll call it a night. This was a prayer, March of 1863. President Davis, Jefferson Davis of the Confederate States of America, calls for a day of fasting. Those were popular back then. Right. This is about 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, and at in the synagogue Beit Ahava, right, House of Love, Reverend M.J. Michael Bacher, who is their spiritual leader, led the congregation, gave a sermon supporting the Confederacy, and offered a prayer, right? If you look in the second paragraph here, the manservant and the maidservants thou hast given unto us, the enemy are attempting to seduce, that they too may turn against us. He's talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. Whom thou hast appointed over them as instructors in thy wise dispensation. We believe, O God, that piety cannot subsist apart from patriotism. We love our country because thou hast given it unto us as a blessing and a heritage for our children. Bring salvation to the Confederate States of America. So what about during the war? Well, I think it's fair to say that generally, while Jews experience anti-Semitism wherever they live, during the Civil War, it was probably greater in the North than in the South. There was a strong history of acceptance of Jews in the South. If you look at Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, these were all communities that welcomed Jews. Then if you compare Massachusetts, right, Boston, Jews were kicked out until we're not allowed in throughout the 17th century. New York, Peter Stuyvesant in New Amsterdam didn't want to let them land. Jews found more tolerance typically, interestingly, in the South. There was also, of course, General Grant's infamous General Order, number 11, which kicked all the Jews out of Western Tennessee and parts of Kentucky because he believed that Jews were speculators trying to corner the market on a black market cotton and drive up prices, which benefited the South. Lincoln, by the way, as soon as he got wind of that, he rescinded the order. And Lincoln was actually quite supportive of Jews. We have Jewish chaplains in United States military forces, thanks to the Civil War and Lincoln. But there were about 150,000 Jews in the United States in 1860 on the cusp of the Civil War. There are lots of estimates. The most scientific ones, such as they are, indicate there were about 7,000 who fought for the Union, 3,000 who fought for the Confederacy, total of 10,000. Not an insignificant number of 150, and approximately 600 killed on both sides together. We don't know if that was as a result of battle or wounds or illness. As deadly as battles could be and as bloody as they could be, more people died in the army, in both armies from disease than they did from battle wounds. So we were invested. So, you know, if I have to sum this up, I would say Jews were not we're not spokespersons of 21st century morality in the middle of the 19th century. There were Jews who were abolitionists. There were Jews who fought because they were drafted. There were Jews who fought because they felt their country, North or South, was their country. There were Jews who imbibed the attitude, if you lived in the Confederacy, if you lived in the South, you were likely to have the same attitudes as your neighbors. So we're not immune to that. There are also examples of Jews who were compassionate and you know, within the limits of a condescending, paternalistic, dehumanizing system, were still, in their eyes, and relative to the time, and relative to the kind of brutality they might have practiced, perhaps more compassionate than some. But I think it's important we not judge the people of that age either too leniently or too harshly. We can see the wrong from our vantage point in time, but I think to study history, you also have to be able to put yourself into that period and at least see what they saw, even if you yourself would never have any desire to live and practice that kind of relationship with other human beings.
I am muted.
So I'm going to let folks comments, questions. Next time around, we're going to talk more about Reconstruction and Jim Crow and, you know, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and Jews who moved to the South, right, as Eastern European Jews begin to come to this country. But in the meantime, any questions?
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yes, Marty.
Okay. There were Jews that did fight on both sides of the aisle. And at the end of the Civil War, they were known as the Hebrew War Veterans.
Uh-huh.
And that was the beginning of the Jewish War Veterans, which is the oldest active veterans organization in the country.
Yes.
If you go back to New York with Peter Stuyvesant, a lot of the Jews there became policemen under Peter Stuyvesant. So Jews were always active in some form.
Okay.
I don't know.
By the way, there is a little graveyard in Chinatown. You could easily miss it. It's like a quarter acre, and it has a fence so you can't get in. But it's the original, when we take the 8th graders up to New York for their annual trip, we take them there and walk by, and it's the oldest Jewish cemetery in North America, and it's from the late 16th, early 17th century, belonged to Shereth Israel, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And there are a number of Jewish Revolutionary War veterans that are buried there. But it's only open on Memorial Day, so I've never been up there to go inside. But it's kind of a neat place. Any other thoughts, comments?
Yeah, Rabbi,
Okay, Stephen?
yeah, you had mentioned that the Jewish population, the rabbi, were very active in the civil rights movement. Years ago.
Well, we haven't gotten there. That's not for another couple weeks.
Okay.
But yes, there were definitely many active rabbis in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I just want to comment why. Years ago, I used to go to a shiurim Saturday night at Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik in Boston. And he was talking about why did God want the Jewish people to be in Egypt as slaves for 400 years. And his answer was, God wanted a certain quality inculcated in the Jewish population. That in order to have the quality of Rahmanos, of compassion, one had to live slavery. And that could be one of the reasons that Jewish people have been very active in the civil rights movement, because it's part of our DNA.
Right. I guess the people who owned slaves, though, didn't get the memo. But I mean, but sure, yes.
About 10 years ago, there was a synagogue in Northern Virginia that had an exhibit on Lincoln's Jews. Evidently, during the Civil War, there was a shortage of clothing and food and things in Northern Virginia. So he encouraged the Jews to move to Northern Virginia and set up stores. And that's where some of the major stores in Washington got started. And also, Toro Synagogue was a stop on the Underground Railroad.
So, okay. Well, there was no congregation at the Turo Synagogue in the 1860s.
Okay, I'm not going to.
But the building was there, and
do this. Okay.
so it could certainly have been used. But that's how Neiman Marcus got started in Northern Virginia. Just kidding.
Well, it's out of business anyway. But there
Neiman
was
Marcus is much later.
Garfinkel's, and there was Lowenstein's. No, there were quite a number of Jewish stores.
Well, Julius Rosenwald is one of the founders of Sears Roebuck,
But that
and
was
also
Chicago.
one of the founders of the NAACP. But anyway,
Maybe 100 years.
other questions?
Rabbi,
Comments?
Rabbi, is this being recorded by any chance?
It is.
It shows it's being recorded.
If that's the case, would you be able to make the link to the recording available? I missed a little bit trying to help out Gary with something.
Oh, sure. Well, just send $9.95 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to Lubliner Ministries, Box 422, Bakersfield, California.
Okay, I will
no,
send you double the
absolutely.
amount.
I'd be happy to.
I'll be sending you double the amount because Dana said she wanted to hear this too.
Okay.
So
Other thoughts, comments?
Rabbi,
observations?
I just have a suggestion that people may not be aware of, that to try to mute yourself when you're not talking. So.
Always a good thing. Thank you, Michelle. It's true. We can hear everything that everybody is doing.
Say about Levi Strauss. Rabbi, one of the outstanding merchants of that time was Levi Strauss.
Yeah, he was out west. Yeah.
He was a cowboy. He was out west. He wasn't here.
I don't know if he's a cowboy, but yeah, he was selling tents after the gold rush in San Francisco, and then he said, you know, these denim tents, I bet you they'd make good pants for folks. I mean, and that is actually true.
Good night, John. Good night, John. Bye-bye.
Good night, Mother.
She sees me. Bye, Mother.
Good night.
Good night. Say. Okay.
Good night, Mom. Any other,
She's so cute.
I'll speak to you tomorrow.
okay, you got it.
Okay. All right.
Any other, questions, like germane to the topic, though?
Rabbi, I wanted to ask a suggestion on how we might understand this history in terms of what is going on now. Like what ought we be kind of learning or digesting from this history for ourselves now?
Great question. I can only tell you what my takeaway is, and not you know, people have to decide for themselves if this makes sense to you or not. My takeaway from all of this is that even though Jews have been marginalized in so many ways and in so many parts of the world, and even though anti-Semitism in this country, God knows, is real, was, is, and hopefully won't be, but probably will be, our history as American Jews is still very unusual and unique. And unlike other places, we have felt more at home in this country than we have anywhere other than Israel. And historically, that has, on the one hand, enabled us to be very comfortable in kind of being, you know, for some Jews to sort of be in your face Judaism. If you look at the ultra-Orthodox, as much as they don't buy in to American culture and oppose it, there's something uniquely American that they are able to use the political system and democracy and to be, you know, so comfortable being who they are. That kind of approach to working the levers of democracy wasn't true of Hasidim in Eastern Europe. It is something that developed uniquely in this country. And that's a very, very extreme example. But when I look at Jews and their level of comfort, and we are not, our experience has not been the African-American experience. We have benefited from whiteness. Somebody once said to me, an African-American friend of mine said, you know, the Jews of America have been blacks. And if you look at how deeply racism is rooted, I didn't know this until just the other day. The third stanza, we don't sing it anymore, but the third stanza of the Star Spangled Banner actually castigates the British for offering freedom to African-American slaves to fight against the Americans. Francis Scott Key was a slaveholder. The Constitution counted African Americans for the purpose of representation of voting, even though they couldn't vote, 60% of one human being. And the Supreme Court of the United States in 1857 said that an African American couldn't sue in any court because if you are a slave, you are property. Property cannot sue. There is no contractual or there's no grounds on which a piece of property can sue. And that's not even, looking into the somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 African Americans who have been lynched, the redlining, Jim Crow laws. There has been so much racism that has been woven into the fabric of American society that I don't think we necessarily always stop to think about it or see it. When I look at Jews in that early period, I'm not looking at Judaism. I'm looking at people who were white, minority in religion, but were still able to get on the train, maybe not drive the train, but get on the train because of their whiteness. So that's really the lesson that I personally extrapolate. I'll close with one really quick story, and I think I'll talk more about this in a few weeks. But back in the 1980s, after this whole dust up with Jesse Jackson and Hymietown, which was a terribly unfortunate remark and didn't get better with Farrakhan jumping in with both feet, there was an effort to spur on greater Black Jewish dialogue. And I was a part of that. I was in rabbinical school. And we flew down from New York with the American Jewish Committee to Morehouse College. Now, Morehouse College is, it's an HBC, a historically Black college. I had gone to a nice private liberal arts college. Morehouse is a private college, but it was run down. It was shabby. I was staying in the dorm with another student, and the bathrooms were broken. I mean, it was really, it was in really run down, dilapidated state. And we talked about, with a bunch of, we were seminarians, we were rabbinical students, they were seminarians. And we talked about, some of the issues and Black Jewish dialogue. And unfortunately, the American Jewish Committee was, pushing this narrative of we've suffered, you've suffered. And who can argue that Jews have suffered? We've suffered terribly, just not in the United States, the way African Americans have. What they saw was an affluent group of white folks who were Jewish. And then we took a tour that afternoon of the temple in Atlanta. If you've ever been to the temple, man, it's palatial looking. I mean, you've been in that main sanctuary, that 2-story ark with the golden cornucopias and the electric ark that opens, and the Great Seal of the United States on the ceiling, 40, 50-foot ceiling. It is impressive. They had never, seen a sanctuary like this. They by and large worshipped in, small, many of them were from rural parts of the South. Their churches were small and very unassuming. And when we were taking a tour, the guide showed us the area outside what had been the main entrance in 1958. In the fall of 1958, there had been a bombing. Earlier that year, there had been a bombing here, actually, at the JJC in April. And the tour guide showed us, you couldn't tell where the bomb was. It had been 35 years at that point, and the door had been repaired, and it was a heavy, big oak door. And she said, and I felt myself getting ready to sink into the ground. She said, you see, there was a bombing here in 1958, and so, we suffered too during the civil rights movement. Now, that was a bombing at the temple. Yes, it was scary. Nobody was hurt. But then I think about those little girls killed in the 16th Street church in Birmingham. And I think about the scores and scores of church burnings that nobody remembers. We all know the names of Mickey Schwerner and James, Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, right? The Jewish civil rights workers who disappeared along with James Chaney. But I wonder if the two Jewish white boys from up north weren't there, who would have remembered James Chaney? For every Emmett Till, there are scores and scores of others whose names are not known. So that woman at that moment created an equivalency between Jewish marginalization during the civil rights movement in this palatial synagogue, and that equivalence made me very uncomfortable. So we Jews have suffered a lot. Anti-Semitism is, in Western civilization, the oldest hatred that's known. It ain't going away. Now we have anti-Israel sentiment that, that is anti-Semitism by another name. But our experience in this country has not been that of African Americans. And I think we have to acknowledge that and respect that, and we just go from there.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to add that even if that has not been our specific experience in this country, if we know our history, and for most of us, our history is of being immigrants from places where we suffered from pogroms, and we should be able to take that collective experience to be more empathetic and sympathetic to what those who are not white have been going through for 400 years, for 200 years, and even until today.
Absolutely. You are absolutely 100%. The only difference is that for us, unless we came, from the former Soviet Union or another place, our experience of anti-Semitism has been episodic and occasional, not institutional. For years and years, I would walk home late at night to my parents from the suburban train station in Westchester, in the northern suburbs of New York. And never once in all those years was I stopped by a police officer. But we had several African-American helpers. My father had Parkinson's disease and was no longer able to care for himself. So we had some, in-home help, and they lived in the Bronx, and they would take the train at night. And of course they were Black. And any number of times they were stopped and asked for ID, walking the same streets as I did. But they were not doing anything suspicious, but they were Black walking in a white neighborhood, and the police, without perhaps even thinking to themselves, stopped them. So those kinds of, ordinary experiences are not, I haven't had those, but I know most of my African-American acquaintances or friends have at one point or another. And yes, we have to bring that experience to bear in a way that's empathetic, but I think we also have to understand that we are empathetic, but there is a dimension to this experience that we haven't had. It's difficult for us to understand. especially since we don't have visibility, to use a sociological term. I can take this off. You know, I don't know. I'm not blonde and blue-eyed. Am I? Oh my God, I'm blonde. No, I mean, I'm not, so I don't look like Joe, but I can quote unquote pass. You're African American. I mean, there were African Americans who did. If they were lucky enough to have white skin when they were born. But
Rabbi, I'd like to just jump in here for 1 second.
Yes, Michelle.
I guess I've been unusual as a Jewish person in that my father got a full scholarship to Yale in 1924, but wasn't allowed to live in the dorms, had to live off campus. My mother couldn't go to work at Baltimore Gas and Electric because they didn't hire Jews. And my first roommate in 1969 was a girl from rural Ohio who had never met a Jew and didn't want a room with me. So I think that, Jews have had like these experiences, but I think what has really always set Jewish people and Jewish culture aside is that we have had each other. In other words, that we came up through terrible conditions, but there's always been kind of a community, whatever it was, no matter what kind of fault we may find with each other internally, some sort of way to give a job, build a business, do something like that, that continues to invest, in our own community to grow wherever we happen to plant ourselves. And United States has been the best where we have planted ourselves for a long time. But I think
we
that
voluntarily came, except for those who couldn't get in during when the doors were slammed against them, especially during the Second World War, when Jews were desperate to come in.
So
look, I would never, ever, ever intimate in any way. There's plenty of anti-Semitism in in Jewish history in the United States. So that certainly is not, I've been talking about a different focus. There's plenty of it, was and still is.
Rabbi, I've had several anti-Semitic incidents. One of the first ones I had was when I was in the service. And I was sitting on my bunk.
Was that at Beth Shalom or here? Because we've never been
No,
I'm just joking.
This is when I was in the Air Force base up in Geneva, New York.
Oh, that service. Okay.
Yeah, military service. And I was sitting on my bunk, and this young fella came over to me. He was from Kentucky, never with shoes or anything like that. And he's going through my head. And I says, what are you messing with my head? He says, you're Hebrew, aren't you? They didn't call Jewish, Hebrew. He says, yes. He says, well, what are you looking for? I'm looking for the horns. And I had to explain to him that we don't have horns. What you saw was a statue of Moses. My hair looks like it now, but the hair was sticking up. It was because when Michelangelo did the statue of Moses in the Sistine Chapel there, the rays of the sun came through the stained glass window, and it created the illusion of hair on the head, of the horns on the head. But I could tell you several other anti-Semitic incidents that I've been involved.
Oh, I'm sure.
Okay. But I'm not
we all know them, right? Which should make us more empathetic, not less, for sure. I mean, hopefully. Well, I'm going to let folks go. I thank everybody. What, Wendy?
Rabbi, at the temple in Atlanta, they had room in education, one of the floors to house the homeless, that they would come at night, put mattresses down, give them breakfast, and then they had to be out soon as breakfast was over. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they did it for many years.
B'nai Jeshurun in New York, where Reverend Raphael was. B'nai Jeshurun has done that for many years. I used to work as a volunteer there at night. So the temple does many great things in Atlanta. I mean, every shul does.
No, I know, but I just didn't know if you knew that or not.
About the temple, no. I just knew that's where Miss Daisy liked to worship. By the way, in that film, there is that scene where the Alabama cop, you know, is both anti-Semitic and racist. When Morgan Freeman and Jessica Handy are pulled over.
MJ.